Yes, there was magic in every song we sang. Hey, don't let them kill you. Stay cool, be alright. Don't trade today for tomorrow. Tomorrow for tomorrow night. You chop wood, carry the water. Sometimes get away. No lie, the downtown cat. So wild, fresh, so free. Stand by.
All right, howdy, Ags. Hope you guys are doing well out there. This is episode 2 of Exercise Biomechanics. Welcome back. We've got a lot to talk about. The primary subject today is problem solving and problem solvers. And the problem solvers of the future are you guys. You guys are the future. You guys, y'all are the problem solvers. So we want to talk about that. We want to be able to use problem solving, causal analysis throughout the class. We think that's incredibly important for the future in applied sciences, including biomechanics, as well as your ability to be able to deal with everyday events. Again, hope everybody's well, staying safe. Lots of stuff going on out there. It's an incredible time. So without further ado, we're going to talk about some of the problem solvers, some of the really important people in the advent of modern exercise biomechanics. So as we talked about last time, technology and some kind of classic principles and information from Aristotle, from Sir Isaac Newton, and calculus, as well as Newton's laws of motion, the law of gravity, technology development, and everything from really the invention of audio and video by Thomas Edison, through miniaturization with the transistor, through NASA's ability to be able to develop microcomputers and develop telemetry, sending information back and forth. So we're an information technology society, and that information technology really came from NASA. It came from satellites. It came from Department of Defense. They actually had a big role in development of a lot of these things, including the ability to be able to track spacecraft, track airplanes, etc. A lot of that information technology we use today. The internet was developed originally in the 1960s and 70s from a National Science Foundation grant. And the satellites combined with basically information technology is how we're able to crunch large data sets, to be able to communicate those data sets and that information with the outside world, because that's kind of how we do that today. So instrumentation that's been developed over the last 50 to 70 years, cell and molecular biology, computer interfacing with everything from a force and pressure plate, for example, to tools of biochemistry that are used to understand how tendons, ligaments, cartilage, bones adapt to exercise and adapt to spaceflight environments and rehabilitation. And that information has allowed us to be able to really revolutionize sports medicine. And sports medicine is a really important part of exercise biomechanics, because a lot of that is about either prevention, rehabilitation, or rehabilitation. So remember this Centers for Disease Control, CDC, they've been in the news a lot regarding the epidemic and how to deal with that. Its last name is often forgotten, prevention. That could have been an operative word here as well. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, preventing stuff from happening. If you have a pandemic team, you want to keep them around. You don't want to let them quit or get fired or anything else. So preparation, I found as a researcher, is like 85 to 90% of really collecting good data. And good data is the core for really for problem solving. Whether the data you're collecting is developing new golf clubs, and this may not be in it for you, but this was modern technology in the early 80s, steel head clubs. They were much better in terms of hitting the ball farther and straighter than the old persimmon wood. Here it is right here. The head was a little bit bigger. The material is a little less dense, but it's also a stiffer material that better matched the golf ball in terms of elasticity. That's the ability to act like a spring or to bounce back. Today, we have clubs that are even better. They have a large sweet spot. There's a large moment of inertia. That's where basically kind of the mass is distributed around the middle. And the more we can spread that mass out, a little bit like, for example, if you think about the femur or the tibia, and you think about looking down the barrel of the tibia. The tibia, the mass of the bone is basically shaped like a donut. So it's kind of, I wouldn't say hollow in the middle because it's filled with marrow, but it has a soft material in the middle, the hard, dense materials on the outside. And it's the same with the golf club today. You have a stiff, hard material that has most of the mass. That's the titanium alloy that's on the outside. On the inside, you have actually a light foam that's also very elastic and has a lot of bounce to it. And that's why people on the PGA Tour can hit a 320, 340 yards, even on the LPGA, about 300 yards. Way back in the day in the 1970s, Jack Nicklaus was the only person that could hit the ball about 300 yards. So technology development in sports equipment, rehabilitation, et cetera, that's going to be something we're going to be talking about throughout the semester. So we're going to get back to some important problem solvers in what I consider the first revolution of sports medicine. That's what led us to be able to treat people who have sprains or who have fractures or who have cartilage injuries with range of motion exercises and then active exercises to try to enhance the healing process. Today, we're figuring out what medicines can be used and even stem cell and gene therapy along with exercise to try to enhance that healing process and make it even faster than it was before. So back in the day, chances are if someone had surgery or had a severe injury, they might cast them for 5 weeks, maybe operate, cast them again. And chances are that person didn't play again or they had arthritis later in life, 10, 20, 30 years later. So there's a guy in my freshman dorm, as a matter of fact, his name was Jim Ransom. He set the record for the 110 yard hurdle, I almost said meters, back in the day, yard hurdles in the state of Florida, was a wide receiver. So he was basically like the fastest guy coming out of the state of Florida. Our colleges, our universities' football team was kind of 3 yards in a cloud of dust. So that we needed some excitement. Unfortunately, the second week of practice, he blew his knee out. He had ACL damage, had cartilage damage. They put him in a cast, operated, and this is just a little bit before arthroscopic surgery. So they went on his knee and they produced like a 7-inch incision on the medial or inside, flipped the patella over, went to work, then put him in the cast again. And there was information even out at that time that said if you cast a person, that makes that tissue really weak. It greatly reduces the blood flow, which makes it difficult to heal. And in fact, it just never repaired itself completely. And that's exactly what we used to see. So no one wanted to go under the knife back in the day before arthroscopic surgery and before we started to use clinically exercise to try to rehabilitate people. An extreme example, cardiac rehab. In 1955, yes, that's even before my time, Ike Eisenhower had a heart attack, and the cardiac rehab situation then was a wheelchair, and a blanket. That was it. Wheelchair and a blanket. That was cardiac rehab back in the day. We know today if someone's had an MI or someone's diagnosed with cardiovascular disease, or they put in a stent in someone who has narrowing of a major coronary artery, what they're going to start doing right away is exercise. And we know now that that helps the body systemically. A lot of the changes are actually in the peripheral muscles. The microcirculation really gets screwed up with heart disease. So it's the disease of your body as well as the heart. That's made a huge difference in cardiac rehab, just as exercise has made a huge difference in orthopedic injury and recovery. So basically, sports medicine rehabilitation. So the people we have to thank for this, and I'm getting to this figure finally, these are people we should probably know as well as we know Steve Jobs, very famous name, developed the Macintosh, and Bill Gates, who of course developed a lot of the software, originally for Macintoshes, believe it or not. That's where Windows came from. He basically, Bill Gates, when he was writing software, like basically the beginning of Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, etc. He originally did that on a Macintosh. And the operating system on the Macintosh was on ROM memory, read-only memory. And that was done for patent's sake, to try to protect it, which turned out to be a really bad idea. Bill Gates had a much better idea in terms of distribution and business, because the idea of making the operating system on software meant that he could sell it to everybody. And anybody who could make a PC or a microcomputer could use his software. So that meant that Apple had a small market, but the PC market was huge. And so he won the game of numbers, at least for a long time. Then eventually the iPhone was invented and the iMac was invented, and things kind of turned around. Now they may be swinging some other way, but most people oftentimes, they often use these things, the iPhones or smartphones, Samsung, etc., to communicate as much as they use computers. I tend to like computers a bit more. That's kind of what I got used to doing, especially because we're always crunching data, in terms of research. Okay, so let's get to these researchers. Names, people you should know as much as you know Bill Gates's name and Steve Jobs' name, etc. So this is Savio Woo, kind of hiding behind Charlie Tipton. So they're at the forefront of testing exercise and testing putting a fiberglass or a plaster cast, a mobilization on the effect on connective tissues and their health. The health of a connective tissue is really what we call their material properties. And that means things like strength, stiffness, toughness, which is the amount of energy it can absorb, whether it's brittle or not, etc. Okay, so this picture, I think I mentioned last time, was taken at an American College of Sports Medicine meeting where Savio Woo was to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, well deserved. So Charlie Tipton in the late 1960s and early 1970s started to test the effects of exercise training on protein production by connective tissues. So by protein, we're mostly talking about like collagen, for example, and then cross-linking of collagen. So he was interested in the biochemistry. He had worked with a guy named John Hollizy at Washington University in St. Louis on the biochemistry of exercise modifications or exercise training effects in skeletal muscle, looking at the biochemistry, especially metabolic enzymes. So Charlie Tipton took it one kind of step further when he worked at the University of Iowa initially, and then eventually the University of Arizona. But a lot of the key work that's related to biomechanics was done at the University of Iowa. So he basically looked and demonstrated that when people exercised, or most of these were animal studies, when animals or people exercise, you get an increase in collagen production in tendons and ligaments and bones. And that helps to make them thicker and stronger and tougher. So he had a saying he called connective tissues the neglected tissues. At that time, people really didn't have a good feel for the fact that bones, tendons, ligaments, cartilage were dynamic, that they had significant turnover of protein. And that meant they could adapt to exercise training. So that was part of the reason why they figured, well, it doesn't seem like a good idea to exercise after an injury or after surgery because you might re-injure it. But that's where rehabilitation and physical therapists, athletic trainers, physicians, nurses, etc. That's where those professionals come in, because they can make sure that that person recovering is in that Goldilocks zone. Not too much stress on the injured tissue, not too little. If there's too little, it won't recover. Too much, then you get a re-injury. If you can keep it right in the middle and progress upwards back towards full healing, then things are great. Okay, so one of Charlie Tipton's students was Arthur Velas, who spent a lot of time looking at the effects of exercise and other therapeutics in the healing of ligaments, especially knee ligaments. So we have Arthur Velas, Charlie Tipton to thank in terms of exercise being part of rehabilitation for any type of orthopedic injury, knee sprain, surgery on the Achilles tendon, bone fracture, cartilage damage, whatever it happens to be. Exercise and range of motion type exercises are a critical part of that rehabilitation process. Okay, as I mentioned, Savio Woo is right at the side of Charlie Tipton. So Savio Woo is a biomedical engineer by training. I should mention that, we go back a second, Charlie Tipton's an exercise physiologist. You see that here. By training, there really weren't biomechanists per se, except for some people doing gait analysis, that type of stuff in the late 60s, early 70s. And even they were, in a sense, came from environmental physiologists and exercise physiologists of the first part of the 20th century. One of those individuals, kind of a hybrid, his name is A.V. Hill. He's the only person that's won a Nobel Prize in biomechanics and exercise physiology. And he won that Nobel Prize for his work measuring the energy that it takes for muscles to contract. So the energy of contraction or the energy of muscle contractions. Okay, so Savio Woo, biomedical engineer by training, in the 1970s and 80s and even 90s, a critical part of our revelation of why casting really is injurious in terms of the health of a tendon, ligament, cartilage, bone, etc., and why exercise training is so great. So he actually measured the mechanical or material properties. Again, that's like strength and stiffness and energy absorption and ductility, which means the opposite of brittleness. They measure that with a machine called an Instron machine. We have one at Texas A&M, by the way, in mechanical engineering. Harry Hogan's laboratory uses it a lot. It's a really cool thing. It's used to test biological tissues, but it's also used to test things like steel, concrete, plastics. When you do these types of tests, you get to break the stuff. So it's really cool. And measure its material properties. Later on during the course, you're going to actually get a chance to look at and use what we call stress strain curves. You're going to be able to make these comparisons with young versus old, injured versus not, rehabilitation, the effect of exercise training. That's Trixie behind me. If you're wondering, hey Trixie, say hello. Oh, she's gonna just chill out. Okay. So Savio Woo did most of his seminal work at the University of California, San Diego, a really important research institution, one of the best. Scripps Center Scripps Institute is there as well. He looked at the effects of both exercise and immobilization on, again, material properties in connective tissues, tendons, ligaments, bones. The data that he presented at meetings and in papers revolutionized sports injury therapeutics. It's why we do what we do today. So Savio Wu, Charlie Tipton, they're at the forefront of, again, this first revolution in sports medicine and sports injuries. Won again the Lifetime Achievement Award. Just as important, I think, is Frank Noyes, physician researcher at the University of Cincinnati. By the way, I should mention that Charlie Tipton's semi-retired. He goes to meetings, etc. I think he still has an office. He's probably close to 90. Savio Wu still doing research today. And so is Frank Noyes, which is really pretty remarkable. So these are folks that are 80 and beyond, and they're still incredibly important to society. They have, as we would say, an essential job. And part of their essential job, or Frank Noyes' essential job, was to demonstrate time and time again, over 200 publications, showed why casting is so detrimental to the healing of ligaments, and mobility and exercise are the key to good health in those tissues. The other thing that we should mention from Charlie Tipton's work, Savio Wu's work, and even Frank Noyes' work and Arthur Velas's work, the importance of prevention, that exercise training can reduce the risk of fractures, joint injuries, cartilage tears. That exercise training done during the off season or preseason, or even during the season, whenever it happens to be, that can make that extra 10, 15, 20%. That could be the difference between the completely debilitating injury and nothing. And isn't nothing great? That's why prehab is always better than rehab. Prehab's always better than rehab. But the good news is our rehab is so much better. And I can say this, well, secondhand. I've had a couple of injuries back in the day, and I did have a cast or two. So I guess I can say it firsthand. But I had some friends secondhand who had knee surgery, who had especially knee surgery, or avoided the knee surgery, and some shoulder injuries that really cost them, I think, their athletic career. Whereas today, they'd probably be okay in, depending upon the injury, probably 3 to 9 months or so. And that time course could drop to 1 to 2 to 3 months in the next 10 to 20 years as the second revolution in sports medicine starts to take hold. So it's an exciting time. I hope we get there. If we can just get out of 2020, then I think all of this good stuff is going to happen. So again, hang in there, and we're going to see again this second revolution. So the first revolution, people like Frank Noyes, Savio Wu, Charlie Tipton, Arthur Velas, arthroscopic surgery. This stuff basically came together in the 1980s. By the 1990s, doing ACL graft surgery was actually pretty common and awfully effective for the most part. If you get past the first 6 months of rehabilitation, chances are that ACL is not going to slip. The 5 and 10 year follow-ups show that that knee is just as good as the other one, sometimes even better. Exercise rehabilitation. These are game changers, game-changing people, game-changing technology. The types of machines we have today, including Biodex, Cybex, other types of machines that are used in rehabilitation. When you go into a physical therapy clinic, it looks completely different than it did back in the 1980s and 1970s. Back then, you might have something called a hydrocollator, which was used for heating pads. You might have some balls and a few other things, and a mat or two. But it was pretty low tech, to be honest. Now, that environment, whether it's athletic training, physical therapy, occupational therapy, medicine, nursing, it's high tech. And so that's what's really exciting. That's how biomechanics really helped us. It's that infusion of technology and an application that's made it as strong as it is today. Okay, so a lot of times we use biomechanics to look at what the whole body is doing, what we're doing. In fact, in the first probably 60% of the class, that's a lot of what we're going to be doing, how the whole body works. We're taking the body for a test drive. Then the second, like 40%, last 40% or so, we're going to take the human movement system apart and look at the biomechanics of each tissue, muscles, tendons, ligaments, cartilage. So way back in the day, we had some friends that lived down the block, and they had 5 kids. The middle one was Robert, and the middle kid, no one pays attention to the little kid. The middle kid, the younger ones get in trouble and they get the attention of the parents. The older ones basically have to run things in this sense when the parents aren't around. So parents kind of infuse their values, etc. But the middle one, yeah, whatever. So Robert, his brothers were concerned sort of about Robert because he didn't really say much, didn't do much, kind of played by himself. And they were like, this is the dumb one. He's gonna. But something weird happened when he got to be about 6 or 7. We noticed one day that on the driveway, he had taken apart almost completely the lawnmower. All the parts were out there. He's checking out what they did. His dad wasn't happy with him, chased him around the yard, etc. But eventually, Robert figured out what the parts were and how they worked. He was able to fix lawnmowers. Then he graduated up to the truck, and his dad wasn't happy about that either. But eventually figured out how the truck worked and could put all the parts back together and get it working again. And in time became an engineer. So it was development that took a while. We hope to go through a similar development, but it's going to be much shorter. It's going to be over the course of the semester or the course of the session. And what we hope to be able to do is talk about how each part works, kind of like taking apart a car and talking about how the fuel injection system works, the drivetrain, the engine, all its steering wheel, all the essential parts, the brakes. So the human movement system is, some similarities in terms of what happens. It's got a motor, that's your skeletal muscles. It's got a drivetrain, that's kind of your bones and tendons and ligaments, etc. And it has like O-rings and gaskets. Those are basically your cartilage to keep everything cushioning and keep things working correctly. So whole body biomechanics is an important part of what we'll do. One of those very important and seminal individuals who is involved in whole body biomechanics, gait analysis, and especially what are the effects of impact on feet and on shoe wear, etc. His name is Peter Cavanaugh. And Peter Cavanaugh is another guy who's still active. I mean, these are people who were working in the 60s and 70s, etc. They are still at it. So that shows you kind of the power of doing this kind of critical research and bringing it forward and then moving ahead and staying with the game. So you want people like that with this kind of experience that can really help us kind of get to that literally next level. So a lot of the stuff he did that's really important in whole body biomechanics was done at Penn State University in a laboratory they actually called the silo, because it was a really tall building that I think was originally a silo. And he focused a lot on development of a force and pressure plate. We're going to actually use a force and pressure plate, which is the great granddaughter or grandson of the one that he developed. So we can think of him as really the father or the parent of the modern force plate and pressure plate. So he was using it initially to test athletic shoe wear, especially running shoes. He worked with Nike, etc., on developing shoes and wrote some or contributed to some Runner's World article back in the day. And the two concepts that he really worked on were cushioning, basically shock absorption, which means reducing impact forces every time your foot hits the ground. So the design of running shoes was not a cosmetic issue. It was a mechanical issue. And the other thing was elastic recoil, to literally put springs in them. So you could take a step, store potential energy in that spring, and then use some of that as kinetic energy. So that's one of the cool things that we can do. We can turn one type of energy into another. It's never 100%, because that's the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy. And there's always entropy being formed. But if we can put energy in, we can actually turn one type of energy into another. And if it's relatively efficient, that means we can enhance performance and enhance what we're doing. So Peter Cavanaugh, critically important. He's actually, in a sense, evolved in the same way biomechanics has evolved. It's gone from whole body biomechanics, gait analysis, etc., to today looking at the molecular and cell level, what's going on in the components of the human movement system, tendons, ligaments, cartilage, etc. So that's a critical part of sports medicine, physical therapy, kinesiology, athletics, etc., understanding those individual tissues. So today he works for NASA and other groups on how bones respond from a biochemistry and a molecular standpoint, gene standpoint, to exercise and the space flight. Okay, so some kings, or I guess early giants, if you will, of gait analysis, and they would be really important in filming, using computers, interfacing, looking at the mechanics of gait, looking at the energy usage. And if we know the work being done and the energy usage, we can calculate efficiency. Two people who are really important in that area, whose names you should know, are Richard Taylor, Dick Taylor, at Harvard in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. He expanded on A.V. Hill's work. A.V. Hill was the Nobel Prize winner I mentioned a few moments ago. A.V. Hill, he was from Britain, and he again looked at the energy of shortening or energy of used for a muscle contraction. Dick Taylor expanded on that and looked at the energy cost of locomotion, running, walking, gait, for all different kinds of animals. So they looked at elephants, they looked at ducks, they looked at giraffes, they looked at kangaroos, they looked at lions, they looked at animals all over the globe, Australia, Asia, Africa, South America, you pretty much name it, they went there. So at Harvard, the kids do a thesis. So they do actually research. That's part of the requirement. So a lot of kids wanted to sign up for, Dick Taylor's research because they got to travel all over the place and do some cool things. Yes, they actually so these are the kind of reflectors that we often use in gait analysis. Yes, that's actually on an elephant. And they actually were able to measure oxygen consumption. You can develop a special mask. It's really incredible. Way back in the day, I've done this with ponies. That was something else, I will tell you. We actually took a big pot plant and inverted it and used my professor's wife's hose, legging hose, and put, we painted layers of rubber on it, and we made that into a mask for like the horses and ponies, so we could collect the air they were breathing, and therefore collect the oxygen and CO2. So, I mean, we didn't do VO2 max tests per se, but we did a lot of oxygen cost of exercising and locomotion. And one of the things that's a take-home message that's really cool about the horses and ponies, equine species are really unique. When they start running, their spleen contracts. And when it contracts, they basically blood dope. It's natural blood doping. Their spleen squeezes and outsquirts hundreds of mLs of red blood cells. These red blood cells travel up to the lungs, they take up oxygen, and all of a sudden, they're blood doping. So they do well in the Tour de France, even though horses wouldn't fit on a bicycle very well. But nonetheless, you get the idea. Really awesome blood dopers, natural blood dopers. And that's one of the reasons why a thoroughbred horse can run a mile in 2 minutes. So remember, the Kentucky Derby is actually about a mile. And the world record is set by Secretariat. Secretariat holds the record for the Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and the Belmont. You probably know that if you've seen the movie. If you haven't, go see the movie. Pick it up at Netflix, whatever. Borrow your brother's account or whatever you guys do. Anyway, go check out that movie on your computer or your television. Cool movie. Secretariat, by the way, I think his heart was at least double the size of a typical thoroughbred. So he had a huge VO2 max, typical VO2 max for humans, about 40 mLs per kg per minute for a young, healthy human. For a horse, typical horse or thoroughbred, it's about 160 mLs per kg per minute. It's possible Secretariat could have been 250 to maybe 300 mLs per kg per minute. And that's why he won the Belmont by like 30 something lengths. So Dick Taylor was one of these guys, measured oxygen consumption, all kinds of animals, including people. And people actually do pretty well because we have springs that are in our lower extremities and pendulum motion that are really good energy savers when we're walking and running. Giovanni Cavagna, University of Milan, did a lot of this work in humans. So human gait analysis came from Dr. Cavagna, looked at the efficiency of running and walking. Dick Taylor and Giovanni Cavagna actually worked together on a few papers, which is pretty cool, near the end of their career. A guy named Dan Lieberman kind of picked up where Dick Taylor left off in the 90s and 2000s and today. Mostly he's interested in kind of the evolution, how we got here. The arch of the human foot, for example, has been around at least 1.2 million years, and some of our ancestors probably longer than that. One of the interesting things is that the brain, human brain, really developed after the arch of the foot. That's basically the arch of the foot helps to support the body and allows us to be upright, therefore allowing us to use tools. And if we're using tools, well, it would be a better thing to be able to use better tools, cooler tools, tools that are more productive, and you need brain power to do that. Also with hunting and gathering, really, really important to be able to use your brain in terms of strategy and to work together in teams. So humans are really good at doing that. If we weren't, we wouldn't be here. So some additional problem solvers battling some modern problems that we noticed in some female athletes. And we're going to talk about Chris Kann and Barbara Drinkwater. So Chris Kann was originally, so this is one of the interesting things, how one thing leads to another in science. So Chris Kann was working for NASA and also was collaborating with the European Space Agency and people in Russia, would have been the Soviet Union back then. And they were looking at the fact that in the 1970s, there was a series of flights that were called Skylab. It's like the forefather of the International Space Station. Skylab, I think there were 55 and 83-day missions in one, about 30 days or so. What we started to notice is even in the Apollo missions to the moon, and before that, the Gemini missions, that we were seeing some calcium and nitrogen in the urine. The calcium we later learned was coming from bones, and the nitrogen from muscles. Muscles and bones were losing mass. They were basically dissolving away. So Chris Kann was originally trying to look at what were the effects of long-term space flight. The Russians, Soviets had been up in space, some of them 12 to 18 months. So they had the greatest loss in bone mass. And so this is a bone scan machine in the 1970s, bone scan machine in the 1970s. This one's probably a photon absorptiometry type machine. It's one of the types of bone scans that's been around for about 60 years or so. Then he tried to develop something that was even better, that can measure bone mass and bone mineral density in critical areas of bone, like the neck of the femur. That's where a hip fracture actually occurs in an older person. It's not at the iliac crest. So it's up there. He developed some machines, including tomography. Those are computerized machines, uh, bone scans that allow us to be able to look at individual bones, like near the hip joint, or in the wrist, or in the shoulder, or in the spine, or look at whole body bone mass. So he developed what's known as a quantitative computerized tomography, or QCT scan. Um, he When he was working with a QCT scan, he was trying to figure out, okay, why are the astronauts losing bone mass in space? What's the mechanism? So he actually suspected there were some hormonal changes. So he wanted to look at some groups that on Earth had high bone mass. So he looked at athletes to see if there were any hormonal changes compared with sedentary people. And is a bit. There's during exercise, there's a big spike in growth hormone. Usually testosterone and estrogen are okay in most athletes, but some people who overtrain, he found there was a different story. So for the most part, when people exercise, bone mass, bone density increases, the strength of the bone increases, so does the stiffness sometimes, but especially the toughness definitely increases. What Chris Kahn discovered was some of the female athletes were not eating enough, and that wasn't what he was looking for at the time. But he looked at their hormone levels and saw that the estrogen levels were low. And in those athletes who had low estrogen levels, they also had low bone mass, especially cancellous or trabecular bone. So he published it in the Journal of the American Medical Association. Barbara Drinkwater and a number of other people met him at the U.S. Olympic Committee site in Colorado Springs. There are two today. One's in San Diego and one's in Colorado Springs. They met him there, as Barbara Drinkwater said, to crucify him, because she said, we know exercise is good for bones. And for the most part, that's true. But when there aren't enough calories in the diet compared with caloric expenditure. So most of us who are sedentary might only need, 17, 1800, 1900, 2000 calories a day. But if someone's training hard, especially like an endurance athlete, they could need 30, 3,500, 4,000 calories a day or more. Some football players can need to take in 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day when they're doing those 2-a-days in August, and they're big as well. So they need a lot of calories. So it was really almost like someone with an eating disorder or someone on a really severe diet where there was a huge caloric deficit. So they might be taking in 2,000 calories a day, but they need 4,000 or 3,500. That's a huge deficit. That's like a severe diet. That's the equivalent of almost starvation. And when there's starvation or near starvation, one of the things that your body is going to do is actually protect the fat. It's going to go after muscles and bones. It's also in women going to shut down the menstrual cycle. And you start seeing something called amenorrhea, which means they're missing a lot of periods. Their hormone levels have basically shut down. And when that happens, you start to lose bone mass. So insufficient caloric intake, menstrual cycle disruption, bone loss, that's the female athlete triad. So she published that article. This was like in the early to mid 80s in the New England Journal of Medicine. Since then, Barbara Drinkwater has gone on to publish lots of papers and demonstrated that if we can increase caloric intake and maybe watch overtraining, then usually women will regain their normal menstrual cycle and some of the bone mass will recover. And as a matter of fact, we also see this with long-term spaceflight. If you've lost bone mass over a 12 to 18 month period, you can get some of it back, but not all of it back. So it means that prevention and catching the female athlete triad early is critical, because if we catch it early, then we can restore bone mass and stop the loss of bone mass really quickly, and you should be at close to 100%. So current applications and the future of biomechanics, the game changers here are related to what I think of as the second revolution in sports medicine, and orthopedics. Game-changing technology. So we mean here hydrogels. It's the same stuff people use in transdermal patches. It can be adjusted. There are actually lots of different types of polymers and hydrogels. Some of them are natural, some of them are, but they dissolve pretty easily and can be used to, in a sense, store stem cells, store biologics, antibodies, for example, that work against cytokines. You can also store platelet-rich plasma. You can store growth factors. Those are proteins that turn on protein production. So you can use all the ingredients or put all the ingredients in there, especially if you like wrap an injured tendon or ligament, that will help the healing process. So whether we use hydrogels or not, adding stem cells to an injured area or replacing injured tissue is critical. Stem cells are undifferentiated cells. They can become adult cells. Many of them are what we call pluripotent. They become lots of different types of cells. But we can also get them to focus and become a specific type of cell, either a cartilage cell like a chondrocyte, a fibroblast that you might see in a tendon or a ligament. Combining stem cells, hydrogels, etc., we can put these materials together and actually 3D bioprint, like, for example, articular or fibrocartilage. We can do this for skeletal muscle potentially. A lot of this is in development, but in the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, you're going to see this advent, this second revolution of biomechanics and sports medicine. The names of these pioneers they're not clear yet, but we'll know, in time, in 10 to 20, 30 years who they are, and they'll be on these slides in 10 or 20, 30 years. Biologics, these are antibodies, growth factors, and then something called gene therapy, where we can actually use a special kind of virus, not a dangerous virus, something called an adeno-associated virus, or an AAV. You can use a special virus that will basically get the gene into the cell, but these viruses can't replicate. So they can't do what an infectious virus does. That's the problem. They replicate, they damage cells, they do all kinds of problems. In fact, most diseases that are communicable diseases are viruses that actually aren't doing their job very well, because an ideal virus actually won't kill or even make the host sick. It just uses the host and then moves on. So these types of viruses are what we call incompetent. In this case, it's good news. Being incompetent means that the virus can't replicate, can't make you sick, can't kill you. Good news. It can only deliver. It's a package that delivers the gene. And the extra gene, it could be a heat shock protein, it could be collagen, it could be an antioxidant enzyme, it could be myosin or actin if it's skeletal muscle. We can deliver the gene, and that gene can either help to rebuild the tissue, can increase its strength and stiffness, especially when combined with exercise to help with rehabilitation, restoring tissue. So this area of biomechanics and orthopedics, rehabilitative medicine, this is really part of the future of dealing with joint injuries, arthritis, bone injuries, cartilage injuries, all kinds of problems with orthopedics, even replacing joints. We may get to the point where we have natural replacements instead of what we have today, which are titanium alloys. Polyethylene is usually the plastic that's used along with it. And pretty soon we're going to be using ceramics more and more because they don't break down over 10, 20, 30 years. So ceramic knee, as a matter of fact, hey, here's one here. So the future of biomechanics is going to be about better prosthetics like an artificial knee or hip, robotics, that's a critical part of it, and including robotics and making, in a sense, bionic people who, for whatever reason, maybe have lost part of a limb. We can restore that with a prosthetic that can be controlled by the brain. So kind of like what you see in Star Wars movies. So biologics in sports medicine, rehabilitation, stem cells, growth factors, these are second messengers that basically help with the healing process. This one's called insulin-like growth factor. It actually works like insulin. Platelet-derived growth factor comes from platelets, but actually is critical in producing new blood vessels and the healing process. Vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF. This one increases angiogenesis, the production of new blood vessels. And then people today in kinesiology and biomedical engineering and orthopedics, et cetera, are working on better drug delivery, hydrogels. We're using material science, nanotechnology to try to get the drugs and get stem cells, gene therapy, get it to where it's needed instead of where it's not needed. These types of strategies will be used for cancer therapy as well. So we'll be able to deliver drugs straight to the cancer cells, kill them, leave the good tissues alone. So regenerative medicine, it's the future of biomechanics, the future of orthopedics, the future of a lot of medicine, because we can use some of these principles to repair livers, to repair the cardiovascular system, including the heart, maybe even brain tissue someday. So it's going to be exciting, lots of stuff going on there. So we're going to take a pause for a second, maybe stretch, do some calisthenics. There we go. So in a moment or so, we're going to talk about problem solving and go through a problem solving process. That section is going to be pretty short. We'll be back in just a moment. Okay, we're back. Problem solving. It's critical for folks like yourselves who are going to be applied scientists of all types: teaching, coaching, physical therapy, occupational therapy, medicine, nursing. You may be doing some research, whatever, athletic training, whatever you happen to be interested in. It could be strength and conditioning as well. So all of these things require problem solving, require use of applied science and applying that information to try to get better outcomes, because that's what we're about. That's what problem solving is about. Now, in a class like this in biomechanics, maybe you might be feeling like that, like this right now. That's okay. When you're doing a new task or maybe learning a new sport, could be tennis or golf or softball or what have you, you may kind of feel like that as well. And that's what we are going to try to do, enhance your ability to get through the learning curve. So to help with the learning curve, we're going to provide some structure in terms of problem solving and actually require you to show us that on quizzes, exams, etc. as we're going through. Good problem solving is organized. The better organization you have, the better your problem solving is going to be. And obviously knowing the principles and applying them is going to be important as well. So it should be efficient. It should be systematic. It means step by step. It should be structured. It involves basically troubleshooting, how to make things better, whether it's technology, whether it's an artificial knee, a knee brace, whether it's a golf club, tennis racket, or it could be someone's skill in playing tennis or golf or volleyball. In terms of analysis with applied science, there are two types. There's qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative is non-numerical, but it needs to be detailed. The more detailed it is, the better. The more information we have, the better. This is true as a coach, as someone who's working in rehabilitation, athletic training, etc. So this is really, and you can go look at the YouTube video. It's hilarious. So way back in 1999, a little over 20 years ago, there's Tiger Woods still around. He hit a ball in what they call the waist area. So this is the Phoenix Open, 1999. Anything off basically the fairway in the rough is going to be in the desert. So he hit the ball basically in the desert behind a rock. And he was talking with the official, and they came to the conclusion this was what they call a loose impediment, which means you can actually move it. It's okay to move it. So Tiger Woods called a bunch of his friends over. With the Phoenix Open, The fans, they get pretty rowdy. They have a few beverages, etc. They enjoy themselves. Again, a Super Bowl weekend. I think it's when it's traditionally held. So Tiger Woods hit it behind this huge boulder, and it weighed, we think now, almost 2 tons. I think I went back and looked at it and got some information on it. So it's pretty amazing. And actually, Tiger Woods was thinking about helping them to begin with, but it could hurt his back, it could hurt his knee. And he's had all kinds of back and knee problems. You didn't want to start there. What could have derailed his career really early. Okay, so he got his friends to help move it, and they slid the thing and rolled it over. Tiger Woods hit it right next to the green in the sand trap, and then went to finish, I think, second. Phil Mickelson, I think, actually won this particular Phoenix Open. Tiger Woods came in second. A few years later, the USGA, U.S. Golf Association, they passed a rules, the Tiger Woods rule, and it said if there's a loose impediment, only the golfer can remove it. They can't get his friends to remove it. So now Tiger Woods would actually have to lift the rock. He's not going to do that. So it would have to be like a tiny pebble. He might move that today. So a quantitative answer uses numbers, and we'll have a pretty formal way of doing that, and a methodology which I want you guys to use. It really helps because it reduces the risk and the chance of getting errors when you're doing your calculations. And you want to show all of your work. One of the most important things in science is the ability to replicate it. So I'm going to ask you a question right now, and I'll wait for the answer. Have you guys, any of you guys heard of cold fusion? Cold fusion. I think I see one or two hands out there. Not too many. Most people have not heard of cold fusion. There was a guy in the 1970s at the University of Utah. I've forgotten his name. I'm not going to Google it right now. That's part of this whole thing. No one remembers his name. I saw him on 60 Minutes a number of years ago. He's still mad that he hasn't won a Nobel Prize or anything like that. The problem is cold fusion is basically the fusion of hydrogen into helium. It's the way fuel is done in the sun. It creates lots of energy. The problem is that no one's been able to replicate his study. In science, we don't believe anything unless we can test it over and over again and get the same results. This is why Newton's laws are laws. It's really hard to disprove them at our level between the subatomic and the galactic level. So they work in between. On the either end, not so well. Heisenberg, as well as not Breaking Bad Heisenberg, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle Heisenberg, and Albert Einstein, of course, prove what goes on at the galactic level and what goes on at the subatomic level. But in between, Newton's laws work really well. They're really predictable. Like we know when there's going to be the next total eclipse in Texas. It's April, I think 2024. I forgot the exact date. It's like April 8th. I've already got it planned out that we're going up to Temple, because Temple, that's going to be where the right around the longest totality is. And around there in April, there's the greatest probability that there will be fewer clouds. So in April, all kinds of weather can happen. It's actually severe season in Texas. So we'll see what happens. I'm prepared to drive a long way. Hopefully the virus will be long gone by 2024. I'm going anyway. I don't care what kind of viruses are around. We're gonna see that total eclipse. When I was a kid, I got lucky. A total eclipse went through my hometown of Greenville, North Carolina, way back in the day. When I was a kid, had a little telescope and projected it onto a box, and the experiment actually worked. I tried to replicate that about, I think in 2012, there was a partial eclipse and I wasn't able to do it. So my dad and I got lucky. I think my grandfather helped as well, from what I remember. So we made a little pinhole in a box and we lined up the telescope and got lucky. Anyway, regardless, I'm gonna have the special glasses, sunglasses on, maybe the telescope out, something where I'm gonna be able to check it out. And around here, we had that partial eclipse a few years ago. That was pretty close to totality here, but not quite. You don't want to look straight at the eclipse. So anyway, you don't want to be blinded by the light. Um, so qualitative problem solving in the field, a lot of what we have to do is qualitative problem solving, but hopefully should be based on quantitative understanding of these very predictable events. And predictable events in science is what we like, because that means that if we test in a certain population, it's going to be valid for a larger population or possibly a different population. So, for example, when we're testing vaccines, and you got maybe a group of 1,000 or a group of 100, and it works, and then you want to make sure that you can replicate the data. You do a series of studies to make sure it works, so that way when we give it to the population, it's actually going to work. So every year when the flu vaccine comes out, it's been tested a lot with very similar types of vaccines over the years. Because the COVID virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is novel, and only the SARS-1 is really a lot like it. A SARS-1 vaccine was never quite developed. People got partway there, and that actually has helped with the development of the COVID-19 virus vaccine. But because it's new, it's taking a bit longer. So hopefully maybe by the time you see this, or by the time, and then maybe the next semester sees this, we'll have it ready. Probably, I would say, it'll be ready for the public in 2021. With the H1N1 virus came out in 2009, they jumped on it right away. The CDC in 2 days started to work on the vaccine, as well as a lot of other people, and they had it ready for the next flu season. And actually, a lot fewer people died during that flu season than in a typical flu season. So it actually worked out pretty well. Okay, so with qualitative problem solving, and this is in motion type analysis, where we're looking at different types of sports, I've actually broken it down to 3 different things. Is the movement being performed with a proper or adequate amount of force or direction? If you're shooting a free throw, for example, you don't want to shoot it over the goal. You definitely don't want to shoot it short, because then the air ball cheer will come out and you'll be really embarrassed. Is the movement being performed through an adequate range of motion? If you're throwing a dart or throwing a baseball, you want to go through that large range of motion. Is the sequence or pattern appropriate? If you're playing tennis, you see this kid playing tennis, you probably want to see a lot of trunk rotation before you get shoulder rotation and movement of the hand and the racket through the hitting zone. And really good coaches and teachers have had a lot of experience with the skill technique, with observation. Hopefully they understand the principles of biomechanics. I think it's really difficult to try to teach how to swing a tennis racket, a golf club, all of this stuff without A, biomechanics, and without B, technology. So the technology that we use today really helps. If you've looked at slow motion views of a tennis swing, golf swing, etc., a baseball or softball swing, you notice that you can really pick up a lot of cool stuff that can help the athlete. So again, if you want to shoot that basketball, you want to get enough arc on it. About a 60-degree arc gives you a better chance of getting in, of the ball going in. If the shot is too flat, it's probably going to bounce off the front or the back rim. If you're, and we've actually filmed, I think, people throwing darts. So I used to throw it like a baseball, but evidently that's really bad mechanics. You want to reduce the degrees of motion. That means the number of axes which you're rotating. So you don't really want to move the shoulder that much. You want to basically keep the movement, for the most part, in the elbow and then the wrist. The elbow moves first and then the wrist. Ideally, most people, when they throw, they actually point the dart up. It turns out that what you want to do is actually keep it level, even though you would think that the palm is pointing up, and therefore, like we see in this picture on the left, the dart's pointing up. So you try to actually, as you're going through the motion, try to keep that dart pointed towards the target. What that's going to do is actually force the tip up a little bit at the end of the throw. It's going to force the tip up at the end of the throw. Softball throw or baseball throw, is the sequence important? Yes, it is. So we usually see trunk rotation before we see shoulder rotation, and finally elbow, and finally the wrist. So we go from the most central axis to the more peripheral axis. So hip and trunk, then shoulder, then elbow, then wrist. So we would have trunk rotation. You're going to have some hip extension as well as hip rotation. And it looks like for this type of movement, this is called horizontal adduction of the shoulder, elbow extension, and finally wrist flexion as the ball moves towards the target. This actually has a special name. So to get to that, we're going to, I just mentioned axis of rotation. We better define that. So the axis of rotation is kind of an imaginary line, if you will, around which rotation occurs. So it's much like a wheel rotating in a car. And in the human body, we kind of have wheels, our legs. So the ankle joint, knee joint, hip joint, they're all going to rotate during a lot of activities. It could be running, it could be cycling, etc., jumping rope. We might connect the dots and look at knee joint extension and flexion. So the axis of rotation is an imaginary line around which rotation occurs. For human movement, every movement occurs either around a joint or around a body segment, around a body segment. There we go. Stretching that shoulder out. I notice I'm starting to get used to wrestle way back in the day, and I notice my AC joint. It's probably starting to get some arthritis. So I'm starting to do some stretching exercises for rotator cuff and for shoulder. Hopefully they'll help. So when you're doing a type of task that involves either throwing or rotating around the trunk, again, you want to start at the most central axis, whether it's golf or tennis. So for a golfer, they start rotating that trunk, and then the shoulder joint, and then finally around the wrist. Technically, the movement around the wrist is a combination of medial and lateral rotation of the shoulder, and then pronation and supination of the forearm. And so this idea of going from a more central axis to a more peripheral axis, we call this a whip-like effect. It has a specific name. It's called the kinematic chain. The kinematic chain. That name came from a guy named Franz Rollo, who's an engineer back in the 19th century. We see it in basketball throws, tennis, golf, volleyball spike, for example, softball swing. It's a whip-like motion. It's a whip-like motion. So a whip, when you crack a whip, makes a big sound, right? It actually is breaking the sound barrier, we think, and that means the tip of the whip is going for a very short period of time past the speed of sound. That's 767 miles per hour. Pretty remarkable. So the Mythbusters back in the day, well, it wasn't that long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, they tried to bust this myth, and they couldn't. What they looked at, what they figured out, is that between two frames, they had a really high-speed camera. It took basically 10,000 frames a second. What they said was between two frames, 1/10,000th of a second. It's not very long. That's actually even less than the amount of time that when there's a collision between a baseball bat and a baseball, that's about 8/10,000ths of a second. So for a period of time, it's way shorter than that, about 8 to 10 times shorter than that. The tip of the whip actually exceeds the speed of sound. So we can't promise you that with the kinematic chain that you're going to get the golf club moving at the speed of sound or baseball moving at the speed of sound, but it greatly helps performance. So the idea is you're moving the most central part of the chain first, and then as you go out, then you see faster and faster movement and acceleration. This kinematic chain we think really works great. It's also a way of enhancing accuracy. So it actually comes from Franz Rollo, sometimes in biomechanics books. And this is another thing in science you want to remember. You want to go back to what we call primary references. That means like the OG, if you will, the original article, and especially primary literature. That means peer-reviewed articles and grants, etc. Go back to the source. So a lot of biomechanics books call it the kinematic link, the kinetic chain, the kinetic link. You'll see all kinds of permutations out there in other biomechanics books. And so there's some confusion. So I went back and looked at the source, and the source was this individual, Franz Rollo, mechanical engineer in Germany. He helped with development of the automobile engine called the Otto engine. The Otto engine, the automobile engine, and the diesel engine developed by Rudolf Diesel were the first two types of internal combustion engines, which, as you know, we still use today after all these years. We're getting better in terms of fuels, and that's going to be one of the things you see in the next 10 to 20 years. Diesel engines are probably no longer run on diesel fuel. But believe it or not, Rudolf Diesel didn't develop or even use diesel fuel. He used vegetable oil. So it means that we can use biofuels, especially they're thinking about using like algae and other things that are renewable, developing basically these biofuels that can be used in a diesel engine. I don't know if we're going to be able to use them in the Otto engine, which is the automobile engine, because it requires a really high temperature. But possibly, you never know. But with diesel engines, we'll be able to do that. Believe it or not, if you put into a diesel engine, you don't have to adapt it too much today to use the original fuel, which is vegetable oil. If you put vegetable oil in and have the diesel engine run, the exhaust will smell, and don't smell the exhaust. The exhaust will smell, believe it or not, like French fries. So the term kinematic chain came from Franz Rollo. He basically was thinking about how parts work together. So in a drivetrain in an automobile, you have a number of things working together with the pistons, with these different mechanical links leading to the drivetrain and transmission and the wheels, etc. To get there, you need a lot of parts working together. And that's what the kinematic chain is about. He also developed the word mechanism. And I would have thought that mechanism was like hundreds of years old, thousands of years old, but turns out it hasn't been around that long. So mechanism is basically how things work together. And that's really important in terms of causal analysis. So the kinematic chain is a network of pairs of mechanically connected parts. And so here we might be looking at the hips and knees and torso, then the shoulder, then the wrist. That kinematic chain works, whether you're shooting a basketball, whether you're hitting a softball. In softball, we call this a compact swing, where we start to rotate the trunk first, and then we get the shoulders and arms right into the hitting zone, get that bat in. This is a beautiful swing. Fantastic mechanics there. That's just about perfect. So maybe the person hit a home run. I always wanted to hit a home run, never could. I'll show you that at some point the bat I used that I thought in softball would take me over the top. But as we're going to learn, I did the exact opposite of what I should have done in picking a bat. This is back in the day, like in the 80s. If I knew what I knew now, right? Oh boy, it'd be really exciting. Okay. Oh boy, I wish I could take like these golf clubs back to the 80s. That would be pretty cool. So believe it or not, I could hit this thing way back in the day. And even this thing, I wouldn't even try to do that now. This might be good, like if you want to go after a gopher or something like that. That'd be good for that. Okay, so the kinematic chain really works nicely. Here we're going to actually look at a soccer kick. This is going to be a pass, actually. So we're going to see, and I'm going to go over a series of frames. slow motion, if you will. So we got a wind up here. Check it out. So we got knee flexion and some hip hyperextension. Then we're going to start to flex the hip. It's going to move forward. See that? It's moving forward, but check that out. That knee is still flexed. One of the things that's keeping it flexed is interesting. That's the gastrocnemius. The gastrocnemius muscle crosses the ankle and produces plantar flexion, but also helps to produce knee flexion. It's keeping this thing in line. So it's a really cool coordinated movement. And then notice that knee flexion is still there, still there. And then at the very end, after that hip is extended, we start to rotate the trunk. Then we start to get the knee extension. That happens last. And we get some lateral rotation. Also, boom, nice kick. So let's move it back. And I'll kind of do it in slow motion. Boom. There we go. Whoa. Okay, so the kinematic chain, we use it a lot in a lot of different sports. So problem solving is absolutely critical to what we want to be able to do. And that means working with causal analysis, establishing cause and effect to enhance performance, to enhance safety, to increase our ability to rehabilitate someone after an injury, to be able to do lots of testing. And testing and measurement, that's the key of any science, including applied science, whether it's engineering, biomechanics, medicine, physical therapy. It means we're using, of course, the scientific method. We're making observations. We're describing a problem. Then we're going to look at the literature, and you guys are going to look at the literature as well. And you're going to use primary papers from the literature, research articles in your laboratory reports. You'll develop a set of logical steps leading to a hypothesis, which you'll formulate. Then we'll design a series of experiments to test the hypothesis with good methodology and technology, collect the data, analyze the data, accept or reject the hypotheses based on the data, discuss the meaning, adjust, and then start all over again. And that's what research is about. Research. Research comes from French, and in French, it actually has two meanings. And these meanings are beautiful. They're perfect because they actually tell us what scientific research is about. In French, research means to search again. That's not surprising. Re and then search. It also means to study intensively. And that's what science does. It basically searches, looks again and again and again at a problem until they figure it out, and then do it intensively. It's exactly what's going on with scientists as we're trying to figure out what's the best way to deal with this COVID virus. Is it hydroxychloroquine? And it seems like it is. Is it remdesivir? That's working pretty well, but you do have to be in a clinical setting to actually use it. So it's not anything you can pop a pill. We're developing vaccines. We're looking at HIV drugs and other ways of dealing with the virus. So as time goes on, as we learn more and more, it's going to be really important. And even though it's a terrible problem now, I think the new technology that will be developed and the innovation it'll take to be able to defeat the COVID virus will lead to a great expansion of biomedical sciences and medicine, which are going to benefit us for a long time to come. Just like NASA back in the day. NASA, the technologies it developed led to everything from the cell phone to the internet to the microcomputer to Tang to fuel cells, lots of different stuff. So it's about solving problems, hitting a golf ball farther, comparing that persimmon wood with the titanium alloy that we have today. So through lots of testing over really a couple of decades, what we try to do is match the material or mechanical properties, especially the stiffness of a golf ball with the club. You want them to work together and to maximize the elasticity of the collision. So we measure that in terms of something called a coefficient of elasticity. We also try to increase the moment of inertia. That's the resistance against twisting or turning. So the moment of inertia resists against torque. So when you hit a golf ball, you don't want the club to turn in your hand. So you want to increase that resistance by increasing the moment of inertia. And the moment of inertia is the product of the mass and the distribution of the mass. So as you distribute the mass farther away from the middle, from the axis of rotation, and move it on out, that increases that moment of inertia. You also use a material that won't vibrate as much. Wood tends to vibrate like crazy if you hit it off center. That was true with wooden tennis rackets. It's true with wooden heads on a golf club. So reducing vibration, increasing the moment of inertia, increasing the elasticity of the collision, matching the golf ball and the club head, those have made a huge difference. Okay, very briefly, formal problem solving that we'll be using. So stick to this. We have a given set of information and data, like an ACL requiring reconstruction, a goal, an outcome, desired result, regaining strength, stiffness, toughness, range of motion, implementing procedure or process to achieve that goal. So process, that's a kind of a favorite saying or favorite word for a lot of coaches. Process, a lot of times, you know, the football team or basketball team will go through a process. Buzz Williams with the men's basketball team likes to go through a number of different processes when he's coming up with a game plan. When the team can't shoot that well, then he reduces the number of possessions in a game and increases the chances that we'll out rebound the other team or we'll get more steals than the other team, etc. When football coaches are coming up with a game plan, they're going to go through a process in terms of analysis. It's the same type of thing here. So good news is with an ACL damage and reconstruction, we'll usually take the middle third, the patella tendon, or either the semimembranosus or semitendinosus tendon with a bit of bone attached, and actually run it through the bone itself, through the femur and the tibia, and actually replace it. So a lot of times it might be just quantitative problem solving, where we'll have some data and conditions, and you want to actually put this on the exam or put this on a quiz. I'm going to follow this format when I go through formal problem solving for the next few weeks or so. So throughout really the remainder of the class. So what's given with the information you have, what you're trying to find, then a diagram. It doesn't have to be beautiful. Mostly it's a stick figure. So if you can draw a straight line, you're in good shape. That's where my artwork is as well. Formulas, what formulas you want to use. You kind of will have to know these formulas as you're going through. They're really going to help you in being able to use something. If you don't know it, you can't use it. So most of the equations that we'll use will be relatively simple, and we're going to go through a progression. Oh no, a process. So Nick Saban loves the word process. We're going to go through a process. We start with distance, velocity, acceleration, force, torque, momentum, power, work, energy, efficiency, mechanical stress and strain. So we're going to go through this process as we go throughout the class. Solution, the steps that you're going to take. They'll be, in this class, will be mostly algebraic. I'll show you occasionally a little bit of calculus. Every once in a while, it's going to be like an integral, just to show you where like impulse comes from, area under the curve, how we go from like velocity to acceleration to force. That's integration. If you go back in the other direction, like acceleration to velocity, the distance, that's differentiation. So believe it or not, Sir Isaac Newton didn't invent calculus to torture undergraduates. It was actually to connect the dots in terms of mechanics. So we'll draw a box around our final answer. So the last thing we have is just a very simple problem, something my family dealt with. When our kids were young, they loved apple cinnamon Cheerios. The problem was it was kind of expensive and couldn't always get a coupon. So sometimes we would buy the HEB brand, but let's say I did have a coupon. Could I get a better deal? Well, the Cheerios Apple Cinnamon, let's say in the 20-ounce size is $3.90. What we want to get is the lowest price per unit ounce. That's the relative deal here. HEB is selling the 15-ounce boxes for $2.45. It's going to be cheap, but I do have a $1 off coupon. Will I be able to do that? Because they really like, again, the Apple Cinnamon Cheerios. Sometimes we would actually buy the HEB brand, and after this box was empty, we'd pour it in there. And that worked for a while, but our daughter busted us because the green specks on the HEB brand were a different color green. So anyway, we had to make sure we had coupons after that. So given the fact we have a unit price of $2.45 and the size of 15 ounces, so that's like the fine print when you go to a grocery store. The Cheerios cinnamon cereal is $3.90 for the 20-ounce size. You got a $1 off coupon. Find a better deal, lower unit cost. The unit cost is price per unit size. So with Cheerios, we subtract out the coupon value. You notice our format here that we're following. And here's our solution. For HEB, it's $2.45 for 15 ounces, 16.3 cents an ounce. But thank goodness the Cheerios unit cost $3.90. We take off that $1. That's the key. In the 20-ounce size, 14.5 cents an ounce. Here's a quantitative solution or qualitative answer, which is the real-world answer. Cheerios has a lower unit cost with the coupon, so we can get that. Everybody's happy. Thank goodness. Okay, well, that'll do it for problem solving. We're going to talk about the basics of the anatomical reference system and talk about different planes of motion and different movements that will lead towards anatomical analysis of movement. That's the oldest and really kind of most basic type of analysis in biomechanics, or at least biomechanics within the kinesiology area. So we're going to be focusing on that in lecture and also in the laboratory. By the way, I'm going to have a separate but short, and I really promise this time, short lecture related to the syllabus. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about that, have you read it, prepare for the class, etc. That's going to be basically a separate video that I'm putting together. So that's it for today. We're going to see you guys next time, and be safe. Here we go. Got my bumper music going.
Just a sensation to remind us who we are.
Okay, with that, I'm going to wish you guys a good day, and we'll see you again where we're going to be focusing on anatomy.